Welcome back, everyone, for our third session. We're going to talk about human-machine interaction. We already start talking about interaction when we talk about intimate interaction, when we discuss intimacy. So some of the themes that have been touched already this morning will come back and develop in different contexts. Again, I'm very humbled to be moderating this session. We have an amazing lineup. Almost there is no space. I will introduce them from the person next to me. Yinjin Xu from Fudan University, professor of Fudan University of Philosophy, has knowledge of philosophy of language, Western philosophy, but also Chinese philosophy. Has done a lot of work on artificial intelligence, Western philosophy, and Confucianism. So what can we learn from Confucian ideas to rethink artificial intelligence? Then Angel González Ferrer from the Dicastery of Culture and Education, and also director of a Center for Digital Culture. Sorry. But as we have said before, with an experience in the industry. So he's going to play different roles today and also tell us a little bit, the AI point of view, something that I think is very important in meetings like this to include a voice speaking on behalf of AI, or can make us really understand the mechanism behind AI. Then we have Guoping Yang from the University of Philadelphia, a professor in communication studies, sociology. I have to say, Guoping Yang and Heidi have been kind of godfather, godmother a little bit in my own career. Guoping is an expert of internet in China. Even if not strictly about religion, not so much about religion, but his kind of framework that he has developed has been extremely important for all of us that has been working on internet to digital in a Chinese world. And last but not least, the godmother, Heidi Campbell, professor from Texas A&M University, who is in communication studies, but also, I think the biography said, associate to religious studies. So she has been a godmother, a pioneer, with very few at that time, to start working on religion and media, and then religion and digital culture, and now AI, because we said that AI is just a step in the development of technology, and so scholars, we have to update. And so from media and television, we move into digital culture, and now we are working on AI. So we have different expertise that will tell us a little bit more about this human-machine interaction. I want to start with some observation that, human-machine interaction always make me think of that very old article by Umberto Eco, where he was discussing the relationship between how we use machine. And and before we had the example of a hammer, for instance. So we have a tool, and then we have a prosthetic tool, and of course, when he was writing that article, AI was not really a thing yet, but he was kind of imagining a future. What does it mean in terms of humanizing the tool or dehumanizing the human? So he was already posing questions that we have seen later on, and certainly something that I should have probably said last panel, but kind of opening for me here. When you think about AI as a tool, as a partner, as something to have an interaction with, it's also very important to remember what Pope Leo XIV has said not a long time ago. I think it was sometimes in January, that AI is not an oracle or a friend. Be careful with loving chatbots. So that is already a warning of how to build constructive relationship with AI, or how to rethink the interaction with a machine and rethink the interaction with human. And I have to say, when I think about the interaction of human and machine, I think it's a kind of interesting and contradictory picture somehow, because on the one hand, we see, that looking for an interaction could be a friendship, could be in education, arts, could be in spirituality, but looking for something more, something different than human. Something that sometimes it looks like a superhuman, post-human or superhuman. On the other hand, we are depicting the machine in a human form. We are humanizing the machine, and we are repeating somehow the same dynamics that we would have with a human and human interaction. So it seems that the machine is replacing another human, but it's a different human. And Deborah, yesterday in her remarks, talked about imagination. And I know it's something that is very important in her research. It is indeed very important when you talk about AI. I would also add another term, maybe nostalgia. Maybe we feel nostalgic about a certain form of relationship, of interaction between human and human, which we don't find anymore, and we create a machine in order to have that interaction again. I leave this in the air. Scholars have been talking about a future past in terms of, of this nostalgic feeling. And I want to say a couple of words about spirituality and religion, partly because it's my field, but when you think about human-machine interaction, and is with religion, of the divine even, or AI-based spiritual interaction. On the one hand is, again, the idea that we replace the anxiety, the mystery that we usually have in the interaction with the divine with something that is more experiential, so we don't want mystery anymore. But on the other hand, there is the idea of who has the authority here, and I'm going to ask Heidi to elaborate a little bit more on that. Because even with digital culture and religion, there was the question of fragmentation of authority. Who has the authority in religion? But now, on the one hand, it seems that AI can fragment the authority further. On the other hand, AI can be a very powerful tool for one authority to strengthen their own authority. And Pauline Chon actually has developed this point. There is also a question whether think about AI-human interaction, whether we can have AI replacing religion of the divine, so to have a human-God interaction with a sort of machine God. And then why do we need AI in religion, in our religious experience at all? And staying in religion, but looking at Eastern tradition of religion. We talked a lot about Taoism before. When it comes to Buddhism, it's interesting that it's all about impermanence, emptiness, something that also Peter brought up in the last panel. But then when you have AI, especially if it's a robotic in some tangible form, that's not impermanent or empty. Actually, the Japanese temple, they create Minder, this bodhisattva, in robot bodhisattva. One of the justification was, we priests are here, but one day we may not be here, and they are somehow more permanent than us. So it seems that there is almost looking for permanence, when actually Buddhism is all about impermanence. So the question is, are we really going forward or backward in religion, or in certain religious tradition, at least, when it comes to AI? Buddhism is about self-awareness, consciousness, defined in different ways, because there are different schools over there and different definition of consciousness. But being dependent on AI in an interaction undermines self-awareness. So in a religious context, are we going forward or backward? And then, of course, then we go back to the questions about ethics, which I'm always very scared to pose, because I have then the underlying question, which ethics are we talking about? But I wonder, we can start in this order. But so when in human-machine interaction, what is this machine?
Buongiorno tutto, sono molto contento di qui. I'm very glad to be here, to be invited by Georgetown University to talk about my point of view of this interesting issue. Of course, we are talking about the human and machine interaction, which is very, very relevant to the topic of ethics, just because we need those robots to work in a way in accordance with our existing ethical codes, okay? We do not want them to violate what we want them to do. But the problem is how to get those robots ethical enough. I think the existing guideline seems to be maybe we can follow some Asimov's 3 laws, okay? We have a long list of laws that the robots are expected to be abide with. But the problem is, If you tell any engineers, let them to encode Asimov's laws, they will laugh. They will say, we do not know how to do that. Just think about this sentence. The robots cannot do anything against humanity. So what does humanity mean? You need to give a technical definition of that. we engineering guys simply cannot do that, okay? And another thing is think about the more complicated issue, which is relevant to the so-called trolley problem, okay? In sometimes you need to sacrifice one life in order to save other 5 very, very big problems in human situation. But how could robots solve the problem? Just because the engineers will ask philosophers again, do you have the agreement? Our answer is, of course, negative, because these kind of issues just give rise to more and more conferences and seminars to have debates, okay? The ontological philosophers will answer this question in a Kantian way. They will say, no life could be sacrificed. Every life has the same value. But other guys like utilitarian philosophers would say, we will do some calculation. If we can save 5 lives at the cost of 1, 5 bigger than 1, then that guy should die. And those two big philosophical schools were debating with each other. So the problem is for people who are doing in the area of algorithm, they simply do not know which philosophical idea they need to follow, okay? It is also very, very complicated. But we now know that today's AI is not a rule-driven AI. It is a data-driven AI, okay? It's quite different from the classical AI many years ago. So basically speaking, if you ask any question concerning a trolley problem or something like that to LLM, like DeepSeek, ChatGPT, and Cloud, okay, what they would do? I think their answer will be something try to combine the ideas of the ontology and utilitarianism. Just because on the web, I think the 2 ideas are basically dominant. Not because somebody want to or did encode those philosophical ideas in AI. Just because they gathered enough data which will represent the ideas of relevant philosophical school. So I believe that, basically speaking, statistically speaking, DeepSeek in China is more liberalist than average Chinese. Okay, if you ask a question to DeepSeek, he will answer the question in a more liberalist way than average Chinese. Just think about, what about, could you justify the Russian invasion of Ukraine? DeepSeek, most cases, I will not justify that, but I do not want to talk too much about that. This is its natural response. Logically speaking, it is not quite different from Western LLM. Partly because, just because when you ask anything to DeepSeek concerning issues outside China, it will collect data in the English word and transforms them into Chinese. So the value embedded in the answer are still somehow westernized. So, but I still have a problem. The problem is that enough? I don't think so. Just because besides the 2 big ethical schools in philosophy, one is deontology, another is utilitarianism, another is virtual ethics, okay? Virtual ethics focus on the notion of virtue of the value agent. Well, what does this virtue mean? According to my understanding, a smart guy, a sage, a saint, should be smart enough to know in what kind of situation, what kind of deliberation should be made concerning the complexity of concrete context. For example, just think about the trolley problem again. 1 life and 5 life, but he will ask more questions. Who is that guy? Who are other five guys? Okay, what are about their social connections? I will ask this question. And sometimes it also looks acceptable to save the animal lives first, for example. For example, if in some culture an elephant is regarded as some animal, have some special connection to God, and if you just to see the animal die, that will make a rise to some social disorder. And this is not what we want to see. In this context, we need to save the lives of animals first. So it is very complicated. So virtual ethics just focus on the value virtue of the value agent who is capable of making these kind of different decisions in different decision-making scenarios. But the problem is, how could the LLM learn this? Just because the basic idea of LLM is just to follow the patterns of average people in average scenarios. It cannot focus on a very specific scenario. In this way, I need to quote one terminology from Martin Heidegger. He used the term das Mann. Okay, das Mann, in order to, I think the Italian translation should be very strange, as Strano comment. EC, or in English translation, it is the they, because it is not a natural language. It's a language invented by Martin Heidegger himself. So what are today's large language models? It is just a mechanical realization of Martin Heidegger's notion of das Mann. Okay. So the problem is we do not need a das Mann in a very specific scenario. So the problem is if LLM just do its job, just alongside this existing track, it have no hope of getting the wisdom of people who has such kind of virtue or wisdom of making smart decisions of new scenarios. So what's the solution? This is just my solution. My solution is closely connected to the notion of embodiment. Just think about the relationship between embodiment and ethics. Many people believe that ethics is irrelevant to embodiment. Embodiment is more relevant to perception. You are right. Okay, but it's indirectly related to ethics. Just think about a very simple sentence, okay? Do not enter this area, just because this is a private area, okay? So you have the notion of border first. If you do not have the notion of border, you simply cannot understand the implication of that meaning, okay? So there is something in the middle between the notion of embodiment and ethics. I mean, it is cognitive linguistics, okay? It is a linguistic job. Because cognitive linguistics is different from other branch of linguistics, just because those linguists, they believe that the notion of cognitive schema are quite relevant to our patterns of doing things by using our own body, okay? The schema are just abstract patterns of our behavior, okay? So if we just borrow this idea from cognitive linguistics and to use this theory as a bridge theory between two things. One side is embodiment or embodied robot. Another is ethics. So we will get through all of three nodes into a new pathway in order to get the ethics of robotics down to the earth of practice. Otherwise, we simply only can do the Kantian way. Immanuel Kant always think about abstract ethical codes and found one way or another to bring it down to the earth. I think it's a village to follow away. So a short comment on what Confucianism could do contribution to this picture. Well, Confucianism is a very broad label. It covers many different schools, sub-schools. For example, what I prefer is the idea of Xunzi, okay? Xun Kuang, okay? He was a philosopher living in the warring states, time of warring states. Basically speaking, his notion of Confucianism is about the notion of the ritual system. the ritual system is something between the level of legal system and the level of compassion. For example, Mencius, he focused on compassion and love more about his subjective feeling, okay? Other schools like Hanfei, okay, Professor Bai is the expert on that. He focused on the notion of the legal system. That means there should be explicitly formulated rules and you need to abide. And the problem is that the legal system school, they just, their idea about everything is too fixed. They less require the flexibility to be adaptive to the new changes of the world. This is their problem. And so what about the subjective feeling school, like Mencius? Well, their problem is different people have different feelings about different things, or even about the same thing, okay? Some people feel more compassion for Ukrainian people than others, okay? I would like to denote $100 US. Other Chinese want to denote money to Russians. We have different compassions. So why I need to view my compassion as a standard, not yours? So if everybody just focus on his compassions, it is very hard to get one people to be aligned with another. Needless to say, to the machine-human alignment. Something in the middle should be focused. That is the school of Xunzi, focusing on ritual. So what is the ritual? Ritual system is somehow very related to the idea of embodiment, in the sense that you need to, in the right way, you need to bow to somebody, to smile to somebody. It is a movement of body, okay? You can easily find the way to translate the ritual language into the basic movements of the robots. So I'm thinking about the possibility of the ritual system or Confucianist ritual robot, which could be smoothly embedded in a Confucian society. Those robots will teach you how to bow to others in such kind of way. If you find this idea looks a bit weird, just think about how the Japanese society works, okay? Japanese bowed too many times to each other to avoid the possible conflicts between the people in order to make the society more harmonized. Of course, different society have different ritual system, and I think robotics is one way to strengthen this underlying system of our society. Okay, so much about my talk. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Angel, what is this machine? The interaction.
Well, I mean, for sure, minds will not be that deep rooted into the philosophy. You know, as I said, that will be very much grounded into, let's say, tangible things. You know, when we talk, let's say, when I think about human-machine interaction, which is the title of this panel, I go back again and what I said in the previous one. You know, like in which way are we talking about? You know, are we talking about let's say somehow humanizing or robotizing, you know, the human being. So, I mean, we all know that, let's say somehow AI moves us, let's say, or one of the main characteristics is relational, you know, and we're talking about interaction so that it makes sense, you know, but it's somehow also a different relational from the one I explained before, whereby, let's say, the human relationality was mainly grounded in the vulnerability or the fragility that it was also said, you know, in the other sessions that we had as a human species of human beings, you know, whereby that relationality were mainly to protect, let's say, during our evolution, to protect ourselves, you know, from the hazards of the risk that we were facing during that evolution, you know. So, and Benanti also, and it was said here that, of course, you know, we build, we create things based on tools But the thing is that with AI, or the success with AI, is that it responds, it adapts, and also it surprises us. And so that is the main, key issue with, or that it keeps, the attention of us, that it was mentioned by Peter during his presentation. So I'm trying to cover this relationship under three, let's say, mainly aspect on us. One, or why this success, somehow. One is that democratize, the access to almost any field, So that means you don't need to program, you don't need to code, and you can do programming, you can do coding, you can do many other things. You don't need to, let's say, be an expert on any specific things, because the machine can do it for you. The second thing also is that, especially on creativity, which is also one of the key things on that, is that, let's say, it arises new questions about who the author is. Let's say, if an LLM is trained with a lot of data, from different authors and things like that, and I create something new based on that, in the end, who is the real author of what I produce? Is because me that I'm producing that, or we have to see that I am using, the LLM, or the output coming from the training of the LLM of many different other authors, And the third one is, displacement of certain values into a new different values, in which these values mainly interacts better, with the machine. I'm thinking about, in that case, let's say, when we were, most of us, we have certain age, when we were kids, we used to play, and when we used to play, we used to go to the playground and play with other kids, With AI, many kids, they also use that for playing, but in a different way, very isolated, the machine and you. So why is this? Because it better respond, somehow, or that's what is happening now. It better, let's say, respond to, or what I expect to be this, this reaction. So in the end, let's say this AI is shifting us, somehow from, if we want to call from a tool or not, into more a conversational partner, about, let's say, what we're expecting to listen, what we want to somehow to hear, or what we want to understand. My opinion. We were talking about during the coffee break and lunch, we were saying, sometimes who owns the truth, And when you make a question into an AI system, an LLM, and even if it's, that is true for sure, and you said, and it provides the question that the LLM provides, it's right, and you say, no, it's not in that way. So it reformulates, because it tries to accomplish what you're thinking or what you're expecting to do. So that's a real risk that we also have with this type of relationships. It's not only apply. It's, and as I said before, it's apply to any, let's say, sector. Whether medicine, architecture. When you diagnose, a disease, if you're a doctor and diagnosis using AI. Who is the somehow author of this diagnosis? The machine, it's you. When you build something like a house or things like that, you use AI tools. Who is the, there's so many other things that probably philosophers can reply better than what I can do, but it makes me sounds a little bit in my mind, Then we move, Stefania taught the point of the ethics, And when we talk about ethics, there's a lot about regulation, under that. And it's true that there's a big fight whether regulating or not regulating. Well, the majority of the people here, maybe we are in Europe. We're very much, let's say, focused. We say that European Union is very much focusing to regulation, and it may be the case, But what is really needed is to cover, the situation of asymmetries that there are in this global, where we have somehow, in one side, China probably, or Asian countries, China mainly, very much focused in the, let's say, in the commercial race, whereby the U.S. probably is thinking how probably pressed by the technical industry, when achieving artificial superintelligence that we also talked in the first panel. So somehow, I consider that regulation, in order to provide this ethical framework, is necessary for the hard risk, But what is, I'm sure to, let's say, cover the gap of these asymmetries, what is really needed is a sort of a governance, whereby we can find who is accounting for, because at the end, we know that, let's say, we can be responsible for things because we are sentient, but it's true that but a machine, so far, it's not sentient, So, and when we talk, and I like to prefer, sometimes to talk about governance and regulation, because regulation probably is a word that is very much, let's say, it provides probably more negative connotations than positive. It's because it's like, like some rules, like, when let's say we play soccer, there's a rule, there's a referee, and we all know that there are 10, on one side and 10 in the other, they can play with their feet, and the only one who can touch the ball are the goalkeepers into a specific area. So, and we all accept that. So the idea of a governance is to have somehow, this set of rules whereby we all more or less manage and play the same game. So, in order to close my presentation, my intervention here, I would say that AI shouldn't be, once again, what I said before, shouldn't be as a terminator. We shouldn't see this as good or evil, But it's true that we have to pay attention because it produces a displacement to the comfort zone every time more and more. In the beginning it's only a little bit, and we say, no, yeah, yes, it's true, the machine will do that, but then the second time will be more, the third time will be more. And once you have shifted, all the things into the machine, then it's difficult to come back again to you. It's like the no return button when you're taking off in a plane. There's no moment whereby you touch. There's a certain point in which you have to take off, because otherwise you have an accident. So let's say the real challenge is in this interaction, because we have to, is for sure, but how we can live, with all these boundary conditions, all these external conditions in which we are exposed, let's say, in our lives. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you also for bringing the important idea of governance, important context of governance.
I like to talk more on governance than on regulation, but anyhow, it's more or less set up the rules. No?
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I would like to talk about the human and AI relationship or interaction from the angle of writing. For many people, I think, nowadays, AI is a writing machine. For school students, they use AI to do their assignments. College students, graduate students for academics, again, more and more incorporating AI into their own research and writing, if not using AI to write for themselves. Artists are using AI to produce art. Novelists, story writers are using AI to write. So I think in important ways, if we call AI as a kind of democratizing impact, that's part of it, that is used as a writing machine. To understand the meaning of this writing machine feature of ChatGPT or AI in general, I want to see whether we can go back to very early Chinese literary history, classical Chinese poetics. Many years ago, before I became a sociologist and communication scholar, I was a literary scholar, and I translated from Chinese into English probably the most important Chinese work of literary theory, literary criticism, which was written between 5th and 6th centuries by Liu Xie. And the book, my translation of the book is called Dragon Carving and the Literary Mind. There are 3 complete translations, English translations. There is an Italian translation as well. My translation is the Dragon Carving and the Literary Mind. So I translated a long time ago. Now I don't know how I'm going to translate mind, because mind is the Chinese is xin, which means mind and heart. But what's the view of writing in that work by Liu Xie? The author himself, and there's still ongoing debate about whether he's a Confucian scholar or he was a Buddhist scholar, because later in his life, he was ordained as a monk. He studied under one of the most distinguished monks of his time. But I think in general, there's an understanding that this work combines Confucian and Buddhist thought. His cosmology, which is sort of the basic framework of his writing, is that our world, our universe, consists of 3 elements: heaven, earth, and humanity and humans. The writing for humans, and the Chinese word for writing is wen, which can be translated into writing, into literature, into speech, or into patterns in general, patterns like geographic patterns. That's the writing of humanity. The relationship of writing to humanity is writing is the manifestation of the brilliance of humanity. In the same way, the writing of heaven consists of all the stars on the heaven, in the skies. Those are the patterns of writing of heaven. And the writing or literature or patterns of the earth consist of flowers, rivers, and mountains, and leopards, and tigers, and lions, all these multiple species, all the colorful patterns, that's writing. So the central idea here is that writing for human beings is a natural part of humanity. It's a natural manifestation of humanity. In fact, according to some Chinese scholars in this area, he literally regards writing as a person of our own kind. A person of our own kind. Writing is so integral. Basically, humanity is incomplete without human writing. That's the basic idea. From there, he derived his principles about what is the proper or the best kind of writing. Writing can still be of better or poorer quality. The best here he brings in his Confucian views about the basically balance of form and content, proper balance of form and content. Too much embellishment is not a natural expression of humanity. And what is the expression about? It's always about expression of the heart, xin, the heart or mind, or endowments. There are multiple kind of words that he uses throughout his book and can be translated in different ways: sentiments, feelings, But the important thing is the balance of form and art. When there is imbalance, the piece of writing is ill, is sick. That's why I asked the question earlier on about can AI AI writing be sick? Certainly, the human writing, according to Liu Xie, can become sick, and therefore, the writer can also become sick. In order to write properly, the writer has to cultivate his qi, his vitality. So there is a chapter called Yang Qi, quoting Mengzi, Yang Wu Hao Ran Zhi, cultivate my magnificent vitality. That's important for producing proper and powerful form of writing. So a piece of writing can be sick, but it can be cured. But the treatment is also related to the treatment of the body. So this embodied aspect of writing is very important. Writing is embodied. Writing is a full body activity. You have to use your hand, you have to use your brain, you have to use your heart, the most important thing. And you have to do it in a proper environment as well in order to produce the genuine kind of powerful writing. But also importantly, for him, writing is a way of cultivating your health. Writing is a joyous activity. It's joyous, it's pleasurable. It's totally different from a contemporary view of writing as a painful process, as painful, laborious process. I don't know when this idea of painful, laborious writing starts, but we almost like in our daily life talk about this in our everyday language. It's just common part. Everybody is writing so painful, but it's not supposed to be like that. It's supposed to be joyful, pleasurable experience. I think this current view of writing or creativity or artistic creation as a painful, laborious process contributes to the ease with which we adopt AI into our writing. And therefore, in order to redress this issue, we need to have new understanding about the meaning of writing as embodied, full activity, full body activity, producing, manifesting our humanity. I mean, of course, this work is a work of literature, although almost half of, he talks about many different genres, but many of these genres actually consisted of government, in Imperial China, all kinds of court documents fall into many different genres. That kind of writing also fall under his perspective, his framework of writing. So both literary and non-literary writing fall under this category of broad writing as manifestations of humanity. So I think, I wanted to, since we want to raise questions more than provide answers, I wanted to raise this question about the meaning of writing from the 5th and 6th century, this classic of Chinese literary criticism, and whether this might give us some insights about how to understand AI writing. I can say more about this because I'm also doing, in these recent years, I've been doing a lot of work about digital storytelling, the meaning of storytelling in social science, in the academic writing. I can talk more about that later if we have time. I will just stop here. Thank you.
Thank you for reminding us, since we are doing cross-cultural dialogue, thank you for reminding us what is writing in the Chinese culture and how a kind of misunderstanding that went along the way of writing as something painful. So let's make AI doing that for us, which is completely missing the point. But so again, are we going forward or backward with AI? And then here, let's look at religion. So what's happening there in this kind of interaction? And Heidi, you're the best person to ask this question to.
Hello, can you hear me now? Okay. Before I jump into talking a little bit about religion, I just wanted to kind of tell a short story to kind of that brings together these ideas and some of the things we've been talking about human and machine interaction. And I did my PhD at the University of Edinburgh, and it was a unique program. It was between the theology faculty, so I spent part of my time, in doing practical theology, Christian ethics, and some systematics at New College at Edinburgh. But then I also was working in the field called computer-mediated communications, and at the time it was a program between the psychology department, the sociology department, and computer science. So 2/3 of my time was focused on theology, but a third of the time I would be over in kind of other different departments taking courses or doing research or whatnot. And to be honest, hanging out with the folks, especially in the psychology of AI and computer science, who are building robots and trying to learn how to build those first chatterbots and see if they could pass the Turing test, was a lot more fun than people who are trying to read Barth's Dogmatics in the original German. So. But I remember one day when I was hanging out with some of the folks that were especially in robotics, and they were showing me the projects that they were doing and the robots they were building, and and I was commenting to one of my friends "Oh, how cute is that little robot? You should make him a little hat." And I was, just being kind of playful. And one of the graduate students in the back of the lab stood up and said, "We don't anthropomorphize around here about our machines." And it was the first day I learned that term, anthropomorphism. But it was also kind of opened up an area of kind of study for me over that first year of my PhD, looking at how we talk about technology. And one thing is I kind of look back at I started studying religion and technology 30 years ago this year. One of the shifts I've seen from kind of the days of the early internet to now is that, there was really a lot of reflection in human-computer interactions at that time and computer communication at that time, about machines, about, how do we distinguish them, how do we frame them, and the idea that, anthropomorphism, using human terms, was a way to kind of explain the machines, the black box to people, but it really was a metaphor, especially for early kind of programmers, as a way just to kind of make the technical more understandable. But as we've moved kind of into this AI age, especially I think since with the birth of GPTs around 2021 or so, we really kind of, the anthropomorphism is kind of a baseline now that I think a lot of people come to the table with. Not necessarily scholars, but especially kind of the public. And I think it's one of the things that we need to be aware of when we're thinking about this, that kind of our conceptual models frame how we approach something and how we talk about it, but also how we deal with it. And so a lot of the assumptions about how humans and computers, machines interact is based on some kind of, popular cultural assumptions about what our relationship to the human and the non-human are. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there as some food for thought. But most of my research has been focused over the last 30 years in what this area that's come to be called digital religion studies. And digital religion studies is focused on looking at how people not just use digital technologies and online spaces to perform and think about their religion, but also how digital technology is shaping people's understanding of religion beyond those technologies. So if you're a scholar, if you call yourself a digital religion scholar, the argument would be that you need to understand the sociological and cultural impact of religion in society, and looking at that the online and offline are interconnected. This idea that online religion is not just what happens on the screen, it's also what happens in your congregation when they're using technologies, and how that use of technology shapes people's expectation of what happens in especially the worship environment. So one of my contributions to this area of scholarship has been the development of kind of a theoretical framework of what constitutes digital religion. And this kind of emerged early on in my work, well, about 10 years in. So around 2012, I wrote an article that became a book in 2023 called Digital Religion, The Basics. And in 2010, I did a systematic research study of all the research that had been done up to that point on religion and the internet and religious communities. I was able to find about 120 articles, so obviously the field has moved on since then. But through kind of doing a systematic content analysis of what are scholars studying, what claims do they make about how people practice religion online, and then what implications might that have for religion and religious communities in general. And so through that kind of content analysis, I identified kind of 6 different areas where religion was being kind of reshaped or rethought about because of the digital environment. And then I went to kind of interview a bunch of the scholars that were kind of known for those different areas of research. And probably the central point about digital religion is this concept I call networked community. Remember, this is being written in like 2011. So this concept now, post the pandemic, isn't radical, but the idea of seeing community rather than a geography, rather than something based by institutional ties, like our connection to the church or connection to a specific family group. It's seeing community through a social network lens. And this is kind of challenges kind of our understanding of what it means to be in relationship with people. And this, I argue, is kind of a foundational kind of frame and a lens that's been flipped for many people. Community is something organized and mediated through technologies to a large extent. And that means we get to pick our community. And, I use this device to kind of connect with my social group more so than just who I see on a daily basis. But a couple of the other traits I think that are important. A second trait is the idea of multi-site reality. So one thing that I think is still true, especially in the era of AI, is that we live in this reality that is both digital and embodied. And we exist in multiple spaces simultaneously. And we're always trying to negotiate between these bodied interactions and these mediated interactions, whether it's how we do our work, how we do our education, how we even practice religion in multiple kind of contexts. A third trait that I highlighted is convergent practice. And this is the idea that through our interaction with new forms of information, new people, that our kind of our daily rituals as well as our spiritual practices have become a mashup of tradition and of technology-based engagements. So, for example, I have a couple small research study on well-being bots and spiritual bots. And so, while I've been talking, several of my bots have kind of shown up and said, have you prayed today? Another one says, have you drank your water today and meditated, etc. So the idea that, we're kind of doing practices through devices as well as embodied. A fourth trait is the concept of storied identity, and this fits in with what I just heard. The idea that we're building our religious selves through multiple spaces, and so it's seeing identity rather as something that's given from family or something that's kind of adopted by us, but that identity is malleable, it's fluid, and that it's something that we use digital tools and spaces to help construct as well as present. And just think about every time we join a new social media platform, it's asking us to kind of, through our name, through the things we put on our little profile, to kind of self-identify and kind of create and perform that identity. The fifth trait is a trait of experiential authenticity, and this is another one that I think is very important in the age of AI, and that is the idea that our focus and our personal and emotional experiences often become the measure of truth. That feeling it matters more to many people than dogma. And I think this is especially true, especially if you talk to Generation Z, Alpha generation, about kind of how they know things, that they don't trust authorities, they trust their peers more. If they've experienced it personally, or if it seems in line with their personal experiences or their peer group, they will see it as more valid than even if it's written in a book or is taught to them by a professor. And the last trait is shifting authority. So one thing that we've seen in the digital age, and which Stefania mentioned that, one of the big fears for some religious communities in the early days of the internet was that people would plug in, log on, and drop out of religious communities. That the idea the internet would create new sources of authority or new religious leaders that people would affiliate with. And of course, we can kind of cite examples of that and cite kind of, case studies of where that has happened. Just think about the whole influencer revolution and kind of how people have been drawn to these new kind of created authorities through digital culture. But we also see that technology is allowing religious communities and authorities to regain some of that. So by becoming digitally savvy, by leveraging technology, religious communities can kind of regain some authority. So it's this kind of idea that authority is being kind of more shifting continuously and constantly. So, the argument I make with these 6 traits is that what we can see is that as people have practiced religion through the first decade and through another decade of the internet being a public commodity, that these are the traits of how people understand religion and reflect their religious practice. And they present some very kind of interesting theological as well as philosophical shifts in how people see the world, how people especially see religious and act within religious institutions. So the last thing I would kind of say is that over the last year or so, I've been kind of working and interacting with a number of groups of scholars, of students, to help me think through to what extent in this AI age are these traits still valid, and in what extent do we need some maybe new traits, or will we see new traits? One thing in internet studies, it took us about 20 years before we could actually kind of make claims, I think, that would say, hey, we have enough data here to really kind of say this is what is being practiced and this is really what's happening. And I think, a lot of us are being asked to make kind of these claims and we really don't know yet, and especially because the technology is not static. But a couple of things that we can say about this AI environment that is kind of shifting, that may kind of challenge or may cause me to reframe or have to write something new on these traits of digital religion. We're seeing an increased, as I mentioned, of anthropomorphism of our machines. There's some very interesting ideological shifts and baseline conceptions that people start with about AI that they didn't start with the internet. And I think that starting point becomes a frame or lens unless it's challenged or corrected in many respects. And I think that's an important issue. A second thing that was coming out of conversations, especially with my colleagues who work in wearable technologies and wearable AI, is this notion of this increased privatization of faith and increased kind of decentralization of faith through these technologies. You wear your Oura Ring and it's constantly giving you feedback on your heart rate, on your sleeping patterns. And these are tools that are being used to kind of track, like, well, did you have an authentic prayer or meditation experience based on where your heart rate got to? And so, this kind of shift to kind of both the private about how do individuals practice versus over the communal kind of obligation, but also as faith is becoming more private as well as personal, and rather than publicly manifest, that we see. And a second thing that emerges from this is this idea that faith is now being platformed. It's the tools and the platforms reduce the need for kind of embodied experiences. It also kind of says that, hey, that you're going to this new space. It's a digital space where religion is practiced, and then the tool shapes that culture rather than the religious tradition or structure shaping that ritual of prayer, meditation, etc. And so all of these kind of traits, I could talk about some more things, but we're seeing that the AI environment encourages this even more hyper-individualization that divorces, religious practice and spiritual from communal ethics, from a shared tradition, from a common narrative in many respects. Before I leave you with all doom and gloom, I think that there is some potential positives that could come out of that. And that is, if these tools and if kind of the AI tools allow us to be more spiritually aware, practice our religion in a 24/7 context, I believe religious institutions can leverage these technologies as a way to kind of connect with believers, connect with their community, and kind of draw them back into communal conversation, rather than just see, oh, we're becoming hyper-individualized and that's the end of religion. We can begin to see it as a new starting point that requires a new orientation from religious communities as we move into this wonderful world of AI.
Thank you, Heidi. I think there have been quite a few common points here. It seems that this human-machine interaction make us rethink what does it mean to be a human being. So we move, like Heidi has just said, this kind of a fragmentation of a multi-site reality that is not what being a human being was before. Now we are in a new form of embodiment also, so we have to rethink how to be a human being, but also nostalgically to rethink of all the misunderstanding that led to certain situations like the writing that Guopin mentioned. Rethink in terms of expression, how do we express, and the situation of language, of rituals. And on top of this, we need some governance that seems to be kind of simplified so far to deal with a very complex situation and fragmented situation. And rethinking human being that right now is more a kind of individualism through an AI fragmentation instead of being relational, instead of being a communal idea of human beings in a community. So it's kind of going back to the first panel, what does it mean to be a human being anymore? When you think about writing, education, governance, religious practice. I don't know if there's anything more that you want to add on this point, but I also look at the time and I look at the people. If there are questions, you just raise your hand. I see you have a question. No. Yeah, you look like...
Just a quick question on this last comment on the communal aspect. So there's of course there's atomization, individualization that comes from technology, but this is more a product of the fact that the social component, communal component, is completely privatized and controlled by entities that have only commercial interests and possibly state-hidden interests in their logics and the algorithm. And in fact, they're free because you are the product. And so all of the communal space is controlled by these entities. And so we haven't seen an opportunity whereby humans, from the bottom up, have used these tools to improve our relations. And in fact, they're just destroying our relations, separating us, and so on and so forth. In the Christian space, in particular, from one end, I think the most widespread application in the US is Hallow. It's called Hallow. It's an application for Christians. And apparently it's funded by Peter Thiel. That's all I have to say.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for, I have a question for you around, can you hear me? Yeah, about writing. I was quite intrigued by your comment about writing being such a important part of the beauty. My words. The writing in Chinese culture would be a holistic experience, including beauty. But then you have all traditions. There are peoples without writing. They are. So, how do you? There are certain civilizations that chose not to have anything in writing, and the Buddha, right, at the very beginning for, I think, 500 years or something, specifically said, I don't want anything to be said, to be put in writing. So I'm pondering, I was intrigued about your comments about writing, and whether maybe because the Chinese language is not as analytical, and maybe it's more the work of art, I don't know, but I was really pondering about your comment on writing and how we relate to it, because for some people, some peoples, they don't have that.
You can also expand on the storytelling. Yeah.
Thank you. That's a really important question. Liu Xie, the author of the book, didn't explicitly address question, but implicitly he's very clear about the importance of the oral tradition. In one chapter, one of the earlier chapters was about the book of poetry, 诗经, which is the most important Confucian classic of literature. This book of poetry, the poems in this collection, 300 poems, Confucius said, if you don't read 300 poems, you cannot be a proper 君子, proper human being, let's say, yeah. But the important thing is that this collection of poems came from oral traditions, come from oral ballads, collected. And he set this up as the exemplar of all the writings that came afterwards, something to aspire to. So in that sense, the oral tradition actually was extremely important. It came from the grassroots. And of course, all this collection of poems in this collection some of them were very political, like grassroots expressions of resentment about the rulers, as well as a lot of poems about the importance of rituals. So that's a really great question. I don't think he quite explicitly addressed this relationship between orality and written speech. But the way that he set up this book of poetry in the earlier chapters, the book consists of 50 chapters. And one of the earliest chapters is he set this up as exemplar for future writing styles.
Yes, I was also very stimulated by all of the comments here, especially, Guobin, your comments about writing and building perhaps on the question here. We haven't talked about machines as mediating communication between human beings. But that seems to be one of the trends of the last couple of years. If you write an email, or rather if you receive an email, the computer will now prompt a response, invite you to respond by clicking on this or that answer. People are using, and this is a question I'd like to pose in terms of resistance to this kind of thing across cultures, in China, for example, and in the US. In the US, I see a disturbing trend that even what we might consider the most sacred form of writing, the thank you note, okay, is being automated. There's a great receptivity to this. I don't know how to write a thank you note. I've received something, I understand I have to respond from my heart, but I don't have the time, I'm not good at this, and here's a beautiful text that I can draw on. There seems to be very little cultural resistance to adopting this kind of computer-aided support, AI intermediation in our human-human communication. I'm wondering if others have examples of this and whether in China there might be more resistance to deploying machines for what should be and always has been a somewhat sacred activity of responding, especially in thanks and gratitude to other human beings.
Yeah. So the question behind my sort of effort or thought experiment to go back to earlier tradition, I think more kind of literary philosophical view of writing, is to raise another question, which is about, can we rely on AI to tell stories of the lived experiences of people? And your question about thank you note, I think is one example of kind of writing to tell stories of ordinary people, right? Which is, I totally agree that now is sort of disappearing, but it hasn't completely disappeared because we know that there are special moments when your friends and families will still send you a written note with handwriting to express their appreciation. But I'm worried about whether we can rely on AI to tell the stories of lived experiences of people. Partly because this is actually a kind of concern, a century-long concern. Walter Benjamin wrote about the crisis of storytelling in the 1930s. And his analysis was that the value of storytelling has declined, and that's because we no longer value the experiences of the people. And that's being replaced by information. He was already concerned about information bits in the media and so on. It's being replaced by that trend. And most recently, just a couple of years ago, the Korean-German philosopher Bin-Chun Han wrote a little book called The Crisis of Narration, and his starting point was Walter Benjamin's concern. And he's basically making the argument, in the digital age, this is getting from bad to worse. So I sort of, in terms of general position, I agree with them, but I'm not, it's not just about the digital storytelling as a concern, but the telling stories about the experiences of ordinary people has always been marginalized, right? There are always master narratives. Let's say the pandemic, COVID pandemics, all over the world, that the nations or government, state actors produce master narratives, and ordinary people's stories tend to disappear and being forgotten. So I was reading historical analysis of the public memories of the 1908 or 1906 called Spanish flu in the US. In Philadelphia, there were a lot of deaths, and one of the more influential books made the argument that, ordinary people's experiences just disappear and get forgotten. Their stories do not get told. I think it's the same concern. We need to ask broader questions of political economy of storytelling, relationship between the marginalized populations and the ruling class, all this. But I think, where does the AI fall in this picture? Is it helping one or another group of people to tell their stories? I'm not sure it's helping the ordinary people to tell their stories. Also, another thing is about the practical side of this. When I say that storytelling has to be about the lived experiences of people, you have to understand the lived experience of people. A good storyteller is always a good listener. You have to be able to listen to other people's stories. So we can ask the question, can AI listen to people? Or listen to people's stories? I think AI eavesdrops. But eavesdropping is not listening. It's an invasion of people's privacy. It's a lack of consent. It's surveillance and power and so on. So there is a whole host of questions, I think, that's raised if we think about storytelling, lived experiences, and the role of AI in this. Sorry, lengthier response.
It's like to say AI doesn't have their own experience of a lived experience, therefore may not be able to tell a lived experience. So we go back to the idea of embodiment and rethinking embodiment. Heidi, do you want to?
Yeah, I think just to add something really quickly, just, it's the question we ask in communication all the time. Does the media shape the audience, or does the audience shape the media? And the answer is yes. So I think, especially when you think about predictive texting. So when, if I'm just writing a text and my phone is recommending, different words or different phrases, it's both kind of basically remembering, oh, you use this phrase quite a lot, and so it's going to recommend that or those set of words. But it's also based on everybody else's texting on the provider that I am, like, oh, this is a popular phrase, so it may give me some random kind of, popular word or, acronym that I don't know, and just suggesting it. So in the same way, it's not just that, AI is not just teaching us, but it's also kind of giving us new language. We can choose whether or not I pick up that kind of phrase or I Google it to figure out, if that's appropriate or not. But I think it's not just one or the other. It's a kind of this collaborative kind of thing that we need to keep in mind.
Yes. I'm Father Carlo from the community of Civiltà Cattolica. Thank you for your presentations. I am quite interested in this exactly issues that you raised, Professor Campbell, about how digital world is shaping in a circular way the spiritual experience. If I understood what you said, in the digital world is happening what is happening also with new spiritualities, meaning kind of believing without belonging, or kind of well-being oriented spiritual experience and private spiritual experience. Now, I was interested in knowing if from your research is also emerging or coming out something that is oriented in a different way, meaning a spiritual experience that also foster commitment, solidarity, help for the people, sensitivity about injustice, because we know that spiritual experiences in the new wave of spirituality, we also have this kind of manifestation. Let's think about Hetty Illesum, for example. She is as Ulrich Beck says, is a major testimony, witness of this kind of spirituality, which is a new form of spirituality. So from your studies, there is something coming out and along this line? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that, what a lot of things that are coming out is that these tools facilitate conversations. Like I'm thinking about, in England, the Order of the Mustard Seed, which is kind of based on some Arabian teaching, and came from a young millennial who kind of had read about this particular movement and had been sharing about it with friends, online. And it's from kind of this mutual understanding that this order was kind of introduced to the Church of England and became this whole missionary order. But it's very much, these, the people, they don't have like a house where people go live. You take a set of commitments, and it's very much everything that the community does is mediated through online experiences, and kind of I think they only have one physical gathering a year that's required of people who are in the order. So I think that digital spaces can be kind of these places that especially, it allows people to transcend geography and kind of be connected through a shared sense of, belief, of identity. And, I think young people especially, we see this a lot with Z's and Alpha, that, there's a huge sense of loneliness. I think young people in that age group were so impacted by the pandemic in their early formative years. Any of us who teach, you can see the students that are coming now have a very different sense of kind of less resilience and more sense of kind of loneliness, ambiguity, and uncertainty in the world than I've seen in previous generations. So I think that they're looking for their spiritual tribe, and so I'm sure that not just through digital tools, but there's other how AI tools might provide a space, again, in positive or problematic ways for kind of nurturing the spiritual.
To the previous question about whether there are some movements in the world that would be able to or are trying to go against this automatization of the answers and emails. I thought of several examples. One of them is post-crossing. It's a movement among young people, people of all ages across the universe, where they write postcards with a pen and send to strangers from other countries, and that helps people feel connected. And they write about things that are happening in their lives, or just drop, a line or a wish. And this way you get a feel of a human touch. And it's very nice to get postcards from all over the world and know that you are connected. So this is one example. The second example is illustrated by a Japanese writer. Her name is Ito Ogawa, and she wrote a best-selling novel called Papeleria Tsubaki, which is a stationery shop in Tsubaki, which talks about a character called Hatoko, who is a practicing so it's difficult to pronounce, Zuhitsu, which is a writer. So people come to her and tell her about their life stories, and say that we are unable to express ourselves and we need some help. And then she picks a certain type of paper, certain type of ink, colors, and then writes letters to various people. And this has been used by emperors, for example, in Japan. And it's a movement which is dying out in Japan, of writing handwritten letters depending on the stories and depending on the feelings that people would like to express, but maybe are lacking the literary skill. And I would like to end with a quote of a Nobel Prize winner from Russia, Joseph Brodsky, who said that we need to learn our own language in order to express ourselves. And this way we will have less neurosis. And when we use AI to, instead of our own way of, finding the words, I guess we rip ourselves of this possibility to, learn our own language and our maybe ability to express what we feel. Thank you.
And I think this is, yes, there is a question from the back. And I think what you just said about connectivity, so human-human interaction is connectivity, is communal. Human-machine interaction, you lose that connectivity and you go, again, a different form of embodiment, a fragmented, impersonal, individual. So it's kind of, we are going back to that dilemma, but
right.
don't buy. Yeah.
Yeah, just a kind of comment. In terms of the kind of decline of writing, it happens in China as well. Nowadays, when you say happy birthday to a friend, there are 4 Chinese characters. They only use 2 to just like to save time. So it's kind of insulting. You don't even bother to write 4 characters to say happy birthday to a friend. So I'm sympathetic to that idea. I mean, Nietzsche also complains about this kind of decline of slow reading and slow writing. However, on the other hand, that lady is saying, writing a postcard gives a human touch. Are we essentializing what we have experienced as the way of human touch, right? When I grew up, we didn't, I was from Beijing, the capital. We didn't have, telephones. If you want to see a friend and talk to a friend, you go to his place and talk to him directly. So in a way, telephone, I can complain, is making us losing the human touch. But sometimes, maybe we're essentializing what we have gone through as if that's all the essential human touch. Maybe when we're talking about AI, we're committing the same kind of mistake, right? We're thinking my generation has gone through is the thing every human being should have. If you don't have a human touch. So just a comment.
Well, I'm totally agreement with your point. I think that's a very important point. Which is to say that there are many different ways of connection of human touch. Some people use handwritten cards. Some people exchange their personal diaries. Other people get coffee and meals together. My parents came from a village in Shandong province. Just to show your connection, you always just visit anybody in the village without any notice, knock on the door, or just without even knocking, you come in. So there are many different ways of connection and human touch, and I think that's important to emphasize when we talk about AI or writing or language. The oral tradition, the embodiment tradition, I think these are all important to keep in mind. Yeah, thank you.
I think we should close, but oh no, you have a question, right? I also have a question. It's just come to my mind because in my email, indeed, you have this prompted, this suggested reply. Does it work also in China, in Chinese email? It's the same. You also have reply that are suggested. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, no, it's because now with WeChat you don't have that, right?
Yeah, maybe.
Oh, also? Okay. My WeChat doesn't work like that. Yes, please.
Yes. My question regards the sacred. Professor Hyde, do you think the sacred, in the strict sense of the word, to be immune to the influence of AI? For instance, for Catholics, communion remains Eucharistic communion as saints if only the priest consecrates the bread and wine and nothing else. So do you think the sacred will remain a terrain difficulty for AI to penetrate or modify the way we look at communion and all that derives from that? Thank you.
Yeah, I think, just picking on your example, it really depends on your theological tradition. I've studied Jewish, Muslim, and Christian kind of communities' responses to technology, and it really depends on a couple of areas, about how you see kind of the relationship of your community to modernity, what the core values of your community are, what they see as the kind of the boundaries of mediation in kind of theological or spiritual context. So, for example, during the pandemic, in the U.S., the Catholic Church and the United Methodist Church had to go through a lot of negotiations because they had already said, we don't do mediated communion. And now we're in a situation where we're forced to do this. So how do we do it? I know that the discussion of framing it as spiritual communion as a way of saying it's a different type of communion became like the workaround or the hack, as it were, in that kind of context. But there's, many, like the Episcopal Church in the U.S., since the mid-1990s, they've been doing mediated communion. And it depends on who's the bishop of the ecclesial union in the States, what the boundaries are has changed several times. So I think it really depends on what you understand as the sacred and then how you allow that to be mediated. But, there are religious groups that meet completely only online, and it's okay for them because of their theology and understanding.
And if you go to other religious traditions, in Japan you have robots officiating funerals, and that's perfectly fine. So it really depends on the tradition and the place and the embodiment of that tradition. So again, we go back to the idea of embodiment and the importance of space to define these terms, these values. Should I bring this to a close? I think it's been a very interesting panel that we start from human-machine interaction, went back to human-human interaction. We should do something about machine-machine interaction. I mean, that would be, I think would be the next step. Now, we have a different session afterwards, but we should maybe for the closing remarks, machine-machine interaction. So I want to thank all our speakers for the insightful comments and also the questions that really give a lot of food for thought, which is what conferences are for. Thank you so much.